Hello, I've been polishing off, nearly finished another manuscript for a book on Greek mythology this time, and come across all sorts of ideas that, well, most of which have gone into the book, but there's obviously, given word counts, there's always something that you can't quite fit in. One of the things that's interested me, and I thought might interest some other people, is the notion of human worth and how that shapes both ancient society, like the Greeks and other societies, but also, perhaps more importantly, how it shapes society today and the ways in which we think now. So, for example, within Christianity, there is the widely held point, well, practically every Christian pretty much believes that God created humanity. Obviously, the story of the Garden of Eden and God creating the world, God creates humanity, and therefore humanity has a special status. I mean, obviously, technically, God created everything else as well, cats and dogs and horses and zebras and whatnot. But this idea that humanity is the sort of prize creation of God is central within Christianity, and the notion that humans have souls, again, God created, God given, and that gives humanity a worth. Now, it did take, what, 1800 odd years for Christians to get to the point of arguing in favour of what we would now call civil rights and human rights, on the basis that if human beings are created by God, then they deserve special treatment. They shouldn't just be used and abused and exploited in various horrible ways. Obviously, the abolitionist movement against slavery is a good example of that. So, for a long, long, long time, Christianity inherited slavery and stuck with it, having picked it up from the ancient world, and it was, well, still is quite current in some parts of the world. But eventually, Christians became absolutely front and centre of the abolitionist movement to put a stop to slavery on the basis that slaves had souls. They were created by God, they were human beings, they had the same worth, the same value as free people, as anybody else. Therefore, it's an abomination to keep people as slaves. The Quran says that it is immoral to keep a slave who is themselves a Muslim. So either, one Muslim enslaving another Muslim is immoral, or they enslave someone who's not a Muslim, but they then later at some point convert to being a Muslim. The Quran says they should be set free. Now, that's the theory. The practice, as you can see in many, many parts of the world, of the Islamic world, is that doesn't make a damn bit of difference to a lot of people who go on enslaving people who were either born Muslim or have converted to Islam. So, in theory, they shouldn't, but in day-to-day reality, it doesn't make an awful lot of difference. But nonetheless, you've got that kind of idea that either all humans are significant in the eyes of the divine because the divine has created them, or a more qualified sense in which some people are significant because they've converted to a certain way of thinking and they have acquired a status in that process that people who don't think that way haven't yet acquired. Within the various ancient pagan traditions of the distant past, not every pagan culture has an overt story in which a god or a goddess creates humanity, but quite a lot do. That this or that deity makes humans, sometimes out of mud or wood or whatever substance, and other myths that suggest that when humans were first created, we weren't up to much, perhaps, if we can put it like that. But at some point, a deity came along and gave us a spark. So the Greek version is that eventually Prometheus, who is a titan rather than one of the Olympian gods, looked on humans and saw the state we were in and decided that he was going to do something about that, and he stole fire from Olympus, much against the wishes of Zeus, and using a big old fennel stalk, I don't quite know why fennel, but there we go, that's what the story says, put the fire inside the fennel stalk and carried it down to human beings on Earth and spread it about. And Zeus eventually caught him and was absolutely ballistic chained him to a rock, and every daytime a vulture, well, there are some versions that say an eagle, but others that say a vulture, a bird of prey anyway, came along and pecked Prometheus's liver out and ate it. And every night it would grow back again, so he could re-experience the same suffering the next day and the next day and the next day. Quite how long he was chained to that rock for is never made clear, but eventually Heracles, the great warrior, comes along and liberates him from the rock, as well, in the process of doing the 12 labours of Heracles. It is not intended as part of the task that he has to liberate Prometheus. He just does it as part of his journey towards the Garden of the Hesperides, which is usually said to be in the far west, although there is a version that says it's in the far north. The Hesperides are the nymphs of the sunset, which is why it's usually said to be in the west. So he sets Prometheus free. So these days Prometheus is unchained or unbound, if you want to be a bit literary, free in the world, but for hundreds, maybe thousands, who knows how many years, he was chained to that rock and tormented again and again and again in this very unpleasant fashion. So we've got this idea that humans now, from the moment that Prometheus gave them fire, have this divine spark about them, and that makes them in some way special. Now, not special enough for the ancient Greeks to put an end to slavery. That continued on all through the eras in which Greece was a kind of global power, influencing the cultures around it. It continued on under the Romans and well into the era of Christianity. So it's and is still with us in various illegal forms around the world today. So that notion of having a divine spark doesn't quite translate into the sense that all human beings have to be treated in the way that we now think of it in the modern world, with this concept of human rights. The Bill of Human Rights is not framed in religious terms. It's not saying, oh, well, we recognise that humans were created by God and therefore blah, 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 blah. It's putting it, the concepts in a secular sense, but those concepts, I don't think, would be argued or evolved if it hadn't been for the push within Christianity to say humans are made by God and therefore we've got to stop enslaving them and doing this and doing that and doing the other to them. And you could argue eventually it ripples out into things like enfranchising women to get the vote, although again that's not really framed in religious terminology, but there is that sense that if all human beings are of value, that's all human beings, not one skin colour, not one sex, not one elite social class at the top of the pecking order. It's all human beings, and so working class people get the vote, women both upper and lower class get the vote. So there is an enfranchising, a recognising of the value of human beings that is at least partially pushed by religious notions. And that sense in which I suppose is in a very confused fashion, reflecting on this idea of what makes a human being valuable. Why should a human being be seen as deserving of dignity, deserving of worth, etc.? You've got the kind of John Rawls argument of the veil, that if you kind of, let's say you take the idea that souls pre-exist physical incarnation in a body, and there's a bunch of souls up there in the netherworld, and they don't know, are they going to be reincarnated rather as an Arab, a Jew, a Hindu, a Christian, a this or that or the other. What are they going to? They don't know what they're going to come back as ethnically. They don't know what they're going to come back as, male or female, disabled or able-bodied. They don't know if they're going to come back as rich or poor. Then if those as yet uncarnated souls had to have a say in the law and human rights and things like that, then clearly any soul with an ounce of common sense would want the maximum benefits spread to everybody, on the off chance that they don't want to incarnate as the one group of people that've got no rights, that are disenfranchised, that are treated like dirt. They'd want everyone to be treated pretty well because they could be born at any demographic level of society. So there is that kind of is it common sense? I don't know. It's an argument based on self-interest and the idea that you've got to protect your own future. Now, that future could be, if you believe in reincarnation, it could be some version of you inhabiting another body in 100, 200, 300 years' time. If you don't, it could be your genetic descendants. You want to protect your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. Obviously, for people who are going to have kids, then that argument doesn't work quite as well, but you could say your nieces and nephews and great nieces and great nephews, you might still have a sort of humanitarian interest in wanting them to be protected in the years to come by making sure that the laws would encompass everybody in a fair treatment rather than favouring one group and oppressing and downtreading another group. So there's a bit of common sense there. Peter Singer, the Australian ethicist, who makes lots and lots of controversial arguments, is a little bit like a kind of philosophical version of a shock jock who has a tendency to say things that he knows will provoke people and get discussion going. He has suggested, and it is an argument that maybe fits a little bit in with that Promethean story about giving fire to humanity, if you take fire not simply as a representation of spirit or soul, but as a kind of a consciousness, that humans who have very developed consciousnesses, very developed intellects, minds, capacities, are greater contributors to society than those who don't. So you've got people who, small children who are pre-conscious. They don't yet have those abilities developed, but the hope is that a few years down the line they will do. But nonetheless, his feeling is that they're not quite as valuable members of society, which obviously goes against the grain because a lot of parents would be very upset if you suggested that their small children are not as valuable members of society as an adult who is fully and actively contributing to society. You also have what you might call post-contributors, people who maybe have reached great old age and Alzheimer's, dementia, etc. have impacted them, and so they were great contributors, but their ability to contribute gets less and less and less as illness takes its toll. And again, Singer would argue, as the fires of consciousness diminish, so the value as a contributing member to society. Now, I have to be clear that he's not saying that people with Alzheimer's or small babies or people with severe brain damage of whatever age ought to be treated badly or ought to be dragged out and shot or anything as melodramatic as that. Rather, he's saying that a person who goes out and murders someone who is a fully functioning and fully contributing member of society has done far more harm than an individual who goes out and murders somebody who is not as fully contributing to society. It's not quite a eugenics argument, but it's kind of hovering on the edge of that by saying essentially that the worth of a human being is not God-given in that sense. It is consciousness given, that someone's intellect, their capacity for kindness, compassion, insight, inspiration, their ability to contribute to the world around them, to make society better for other people, that is what gives value to human life. I'm not wholly sure where he would place, say, a serial killer or somebody who is very, very destructive and might have all of their faculties, but is not using them in a constructive way, is using them in a terribly destructive way. Quite where they would sit in his vision, I'm not too sure. I'll have to delve into that one and find out. But the value of a soul, or of a person rather, sorry, is contingent on the fire within them, the fire of consciousness, how it burns, how brightly it burns, what it's doing right now, to a lesser extent, what it may be doing in the future. So it's essentially saying, Singer is arguing, that not everyone has equal value. So compare it to that Christian notion that all souls, young or old, rich or poor, black, white, Asian, whatever ethnicity they may be, all souls, all people are equal in the eyes of God in terms of their worth, their value. Obviously, some might be kinder, nicer, more contributing towards society than others, but there is a kind of a base value that all people have, and therefore even someone who's not contributing very much to the world around them for whatever reason is still of worth, is still of significance. Would people in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, etc. have thought like that? No, they wouldn't, simply. Someone's value in the ancient world was not really individualistic value, not in the way we conceive of that today. People were thought of as much more collective. So somebody was a member of a tribal community, a family group, a kinship group, and their worth was integral to the group they were part of. They might individualistically do things that bolstered the overarching value of their community. Equally, they might do things that dragged down and devalued that community by doing terrible things, criminal things, or whatever. But they were still part of the group. They were not separated from it. So you get people who are judged within the group. And obviously these days we think of that as prejudice, discrimination, not seeing the individual, seeing only the group. Identity, they're part of that group over there, therefore we have to treat them in a certain way. And that is discouraged, not very effectively discouraged, but it is discouraged in the modern world, whereas it was just absolutely standard to think that way in the ancient world. And to evaluate and respond to people according to not so much them as an individual person, but them as a member of a particular community, as a subset of the wider society. So they could be treated in this way, but they couldn't be treated in that way because of their group identity. And sometimes that might work really well for them if the group identity was high status, and quite often, more often, no doubt, it would work pretty badly for them if the group identity was low status, and therefore they got treated rather badly. So this notion of the individual worth hadn't really developed in the ancient world. It's something that comes about much later, much later. And whether it lasts, I mean, who knows? Will it last? If we were to jump forward in time 500 years into the future, how will people be thinking then? That's difficult to predict or to say. Other societies, I mean, we can look at more kind of contemporary visions and get a notion of where things might go in the future. So under Karl Marx, the argument is that people's worth is directly related to their productivity and their contribution to the people, society. What gives somebody worth or value is not their soul, because Marx doesn't believe in a soul. He rejects all religion as nonsense. It's not consciousness. It's not that kind of argument for the fires of consciousness. It's rather an argument about A, how useful they are, do they contribute, and B, how compliant they are to the demands of the state. And the state, which is the sort of bureaucratic face of the people, this kind of collective, the workers, the people, is evaluating what role somebody has in relation to the collective. Are they doing what the collective needs, or are they going against what the collective needs? If someone is perceived as acting selfishly rather than collectively, then the penalties are pretty harsh. You can look at Russia when it was a Soviet country, you can look at China to this very day, North Korea, all sorts of other countries. People are treated abysmally if they are seen to be, even in quite tiny ways, going against the collective good of the state, of the people. And it's defined in very arbitrary fashions, which is why a lot of the brutalities led in China, in Russia, and in other places to famines and all sorts of problems, because people who were quite useful in terms of knowing about farming and things like that, having good knowledge in that area, if someone in power decided, no, we don't need that anymore, we don't need them, they are not doing what we want them to do, they just simply slaughter entire groups of people, and then everybody else would suffer accordingly because the knowledge of how to farm had gone out the window, and people would starve to death in their thousands upon thousands, and at certain points in history, millions upon millions. So that the value of a person is, under that system of thinking, contingent on their worth to the state. If the state finds value in them, they're treated in one way. If the state no longer finds value in them, they're treated in a very different way. So it's quite a fragile position to be in. At least if your value comes from some divine source that never changes its mind, you don't have to worry that God's going to turn against you tomorrow and decide that you're no longer worth tomorrow what you were worth yesterday. You've got some guarantee of consistency from the divine. I mean, there's absolutely no guarantee that the human mortal authorities will follow suit. Look at the way endless governments in Christian countries for the last 1,000+ years have treated people, and clearly they're not acting out of some divine benevolence. They're acting under all sorts of other much more human, much more brutal motivations. So whatever the sense of eternal worth may be, it doesn't always pan out into how people are administered to by the human authorities, and even if those human authorities theoretically are believers in a particular religion. So there's different conceptions as to where human worth comes from. You could, I suppose, argue that it is all terribly subjective, and therefore humans as such have no worth except that which other people in a position of power arbitrarily give them. And if those people in a position of power change their minds, or indeed they're wiped out and replaced by a different bunch of people in power who think differently, then human worth chops and changes accordingly, and it's just whatever the king, the queen, the emperor, the president, the prime minister, whoever it is of the day, whatever they think you're worth is what you're worth. That there is no objective measure beyond that, or at least if there is, it's so abstract that it doesn't do you much good in the short term. That would then lead to the argument that human rights are themselves very, very arbitrary. It's simply whatever the people in power think you ought to have as rights today. And there's all sorts of legal ethics arguments that arise from there. I don't want to go into them in any depth here because it's rambling and incoherent enough as it is without getting more so. But there is a notion in which rights are contingent with responsibilities and duties. So if I have a right to something, that right has to be fulfilled by somebody else. And that can lead to quibbles around whether the word right is legalistically the correct word to use in all cases. So, to give a very small example, um, in Britain, I have a right to get married. Does that mean somebody else is duty bound to get married to me? Clearly not. It becomes a bit of a meaningless right. It can't be enforced. I can't say, right, you're marrying me whether you want to or not, and then the police turn up and frog march somebody up the aisle and force them to marry me. It clearly doesn't work like that. Whereas other rights, like my right not to be murdered, well, if it's violated, then the police would get involved and start frog marching people down to the station to interview them if they think they've committed that murder. And there would be consequences for people who violate that right. So there are rights that exist in the positive, there are rights that exist in the negative, there are rights that exist almost at a theoretical level and probably shouldn't actually be called rights at all. They should be called something else entirely. So you could say I have the legal option to get married rather than the legal right to get married. Option because A, I might not want to get married in the first place, and B, whoever I would like to get married to has the option to say no. They're not under any obligation, any legally enforceable duty to fulfill that half of the contract. So, what's a right, what's not a right? And that's, although obviously I'm talking here in terms of legal quibbles, there is a philosophical underpinning, the notion of what a human being ought to have, what they need, what they should be protected from, what should never be done to a human being. Rights does have a very philosophical, potentially for many people, a theological underpinning, a notion of what is a human being? What do they need? And it goes beyond, I just said what is a human being, but it goes beyond that. So we're now seeing some countries talking about rights for great apes, gorillas and so on, rights for the non-human. I don't think there's any country arguing rights for every single species, but for certain key species, and those key species are usually ones that can be argued with supportive evidence to have that spark, that fire of Promethean consciousness, that they have a capacity for sapience, they have a capacity for processing pain and suffering and joy and happiness and so on, and therefore they deserve, because they have a consciousness that's a bit like a human being's, they deserve to have some legal protections. And usually what we're arguing, or what most countries are arguing, is really protection rather than right in the sense of deserving and having to be given certain things. It's more about protecting them from being arbitrarily killed or tortured, tormented, or deliberately harmed. That's more what is being spoken about than any active right that they have to be given something. It's more what they should be protected against. But it is starting to open up this notion of what we'll call personhood, that human beings, we now think, well, most people now think, are persons, and that has a legal definition as well as a sort of spiritual quality to it, of saying they have thoughts and feelings and hopes and dreams and a capacity for love and for pain and for fear and for hope and all of these kind of qualitative mental experiences. And we're beginning to realise, well, people in the ancient world often fully thought the same in a lot more detail than we do now. But we're getting to a point where scientific research is offering evidence that certain other key species have similar capacities, that they also have those cognitive processes, and that maybe they need some kind of legal recognition. At some point in the future, with all this tedious talk about artificial intelligence, we might get to the point where a box of microchips is deemed as being sufficiently conscious that it counts as a person, and it will be awarded some kind of rights and recognitions, which is, if it ever happens, will open up a whole bag of worms about quite what we mean by personhood. If the Martians ever arrive, again, that we might think, oh well, clearly you're clever enough to build a spaceship and travel from planet to planet. Clearly you have consciousness and a capacity for love and joy and hope and fear and pain and all the rest of it. So we might have to, if they become a presence living on Earth, and it's all a bit Star Trekky, we might have to recognise legally the rights and well, not the humanity of a Martian, but the personhood of a Martian. And the notion that it will no longer be a sense of what makes a human human, but rather what makes a person a person. And that personhood, at some point in the future, will not be exclusively restricted to one biological species. It may be spread across however many species that are, or robots or whatever, that are recognised as being capable of personhood, of having that spark of fire, whether from Prometheus or from somebody else entirely, but that spark of something magical, something divine. And even if it's phrased in terribly prosaic language, as legal bills are wont to be, underpinning it is that notion of something spiritual, something mystical, that there is more to us than just a lot of neurochemicals sloshing about and creating what for some people is still regarded as an illusion of consciousness, even though it is their own illusion of consciousness that's arguing that it's an illusion of consciousness. But what makes us people? As a last thing in this ramble to conclude on and reflect on, all this talk of Martians and robots and gorillas and so on. It's incredibly recent. If we're thinking the history of humanity, it is incredibly recent that one group of human beings has acknowledged that other groups of human beings are people. The history of humanity is one group treating another group as if they're the scum of the earth. They're barely human. They're one step removed from the beasts in the field. And that's not exclusive to any part of the earth. You can go to anywhere on the planet and find that whoever the native population of that planet, that bit of the planet is, they have looked down on people who lived 5 miles up the road as not really being people at all. And so if you enslave them, torture them, massacre them, do this, that, the other to them, they're not really people, so it doesn't matter. It's making them go and dig ditches is no different from making a horse pull a plough. They're a beast of burden, they do what you want. And so you see examples of enslavement and cannibalism and torture and all manner of horrors being visited constantly throughout history, constantly across the entire world, of humans doing this to each other. So that the idea that we have in the 21st century that we're all people, we're all humans, we're all of worth and all of value, and it doesn't matter rich, poor, skin colour, sex, this, that, the other, all of that is irrelevant because we're all people together. That is the absolute tiny, tiny, tiny tip of an iceberg of nastiness. And there's nothing to say, sadly, that 100 years from now, that tiny bubble of mass personhood might not have popped. We might not have defaulted to our factory setting of intense tribalism and doing abysmal things to each other because we cease to see the people who live 5 miles up the road as people. So it's this moment of universal human personhood is something worth holding on to and worth remembering. It is terribly new and terribly frail. Don't take it for granted, is what I'm saying. Guard it, protect it. Realise that it could be taken away. Because in a sense, you go, I'm not a fan of Marx, I think the man was awful. But he wasn't wrong when he suggested that human value is arbitrarily given by the state and can therefore be arbitrarily taken away again. Whatever your religious beliefs, whatever your underpinning philosophies about the nature of human consciousness, if a very powerful government says, right, we're going to take your rights away and treat you like dirt, if they're backed up by armies and heavily armed police forces and whatever else that come along as the agents of state to enforce that on people, it's very difficult to fight against it. Well, I mean, you can fight against it, people have in the past, but it really is a case of fighting and dying and bloodshed, and it becomes a very messy situation to resist a very powerful totalitarian system that wishes to treat a demographic like dirt. So yes, realise that if you want it, you've got to this bubble of universal humanity. You've got to guard it and think very carefully about who gets into power and what they do with it. I'm not getting dragged into the endless, interminable personality cults of politics, but I will say that I do see a lot of naivety. People who think, oh, well, that politician, they're lovely, they say all the right things. Well, they're politicians, of course they say all the right things. It's the nature of politicians to say whatever the hell it takes to get elected, and once they get elected, that's when you see what they're really like. So don't be suckered in by sweet talk. Look at the action. Look at what people do rather than the old flannel that they give you when they're trying to grab your vote, grab your support. Because all that glitters is most certainly not gold when it comes to the world of politics and pie crust promises about what they'll do for you and how much they love people and how tolerant they are and how trendy and right on with whatever this week's fad happens to be in the intellectual classes. Never lasts. Anyway, that's waffly enough and might get people thinking. It'd be interesting to if somebody with a more coherent thought process would like to comment and add their two penneth worth. What you think about the basis of human worth? Where does it come from? Is it actually human worth, or is it worth based upon something that is not exclusive to human beings, that can be encountered in things, creatures other than human? So it's a worth of, let's say, consciousness, or a worth of soul, or a worth of something that is not necessarily confined only to humanity. Might get a conversation going.